Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Reed Hepler, and this is This
Hello.
Week in AI, September 6th, 2024. Hi, Reed.
Hello. We've had it's been kind of a lot of a very varied week in AI. All of them are varied, but we have, um, I mean, a lot of um, prognostications about AI abilities and what could be happening, impacts on legal issues. Is it going to be affecting the election? Is it not? And then also a lot of different reports and varying reports from different stakeholders about AI in the workplace. So a lot of different things have been happening, or at least have been released and talked about this week.
Yes, and some teasing promises of what OpenAI's Strawberry is going to be. Is it going to be 100 times better than what we've currently got? I'm still waiting for the promised 4.0 special voice version to hit my phone, so I'm not holding my breath. However, we did talk about two Strawberry stories last week.
Yes.
Strawberry as in the next version of ChatGPT,
Mhm.
and Strawberry as a conundrum model where the large language models, because they break words into smaller parts,
Uh-huh.
that they don't know how to tell how many R's are in the word strawberry. And I think if I've pieced these things together correctly, that may be why Strawberry is called Strawberry, the OpenAI project,
Yeah, that would
because
be.
maybe I think that may be why, because I think they may have solved the strawberry problem. We'll see.
Yeah,
Um,
happens.
and then the big departure of Suskever this summer and his new safe social intelligence project, raising $1 billion.
Yeah.
And I think he's a
But
brilliant
there's
guy.
no revenue plan for this. Like,
Yeah.
he's not going
Yeah.
to get any. He hasn't explained how he's going to get money, how his investors are going to get returns. It's just really odd.
Well, I think some of it could be because he's so darn well spoken, and he just seems like
Yeah.
a brilliant guy. Anytime I see a video come up with him in it, I want to watch it. Um, Also, I think people may be concerned about the long term impacts of AI and making sure that it's safe.
Mhm.
At the same time, it does raise this issue of companies spending enormous amounts of money right now with no solid revenue plans. And this reminds me so much of the dot com bubble.
Yeah.
Just the rush to invest in, and then the sort of inevitable shakeout that will have to happen.
Well, and it's
Um,
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, go please.
It's interesting, and we'll talk about a little bit later about it, AI in elections and AI in the workplace. But a lot of these companies, like you say, are rushing to get products out, are rushing to do things. And it seems like some of these, especially with like this security thing, a lot of them might be better served if they were nonprofits, like advising people on AI security rather than making products to enforce AI security. But a lot of these companies are going to fail or they're going to drastically change because they're not going to be adopted. I think the number of products and the number of uses, well, the number of uses are many, but th there are more products than people are going to use, basically, because people are going to have similar ideas. People are going to advertise differently, but it's going to be the same type of product essentially. So a lot of these are going to fail. It's going to be interesting to see which ones fail and which ones thrive.
I
So
agree. And even people like you and me who spend a lot of time focused on AI, there are still
yeah,
things that I think, oh, I would like to go learn how that works or do it, but I haven't done it.
yeah, absolutely.
It's hard enough keeping track of OpenAI's ChatGPT, Gemini, and the new gems, uh, Claude, uh, Anthropic,
Yeah,
Claude, is it Claude Artifacts and Perplexity? I mean,
yeah.
just keeping track of those, the primary ones I'm looking at, is hard. And figuring out which ones work with which, there is a limit, right? AI can't take over all aspects of our lives. So
Yeah.
there's a focus limit for people. And so I think you're right. I think there's going to be, a winnowing of the options to those that really actually help people and somehow take off.
Uh-huh.
There is a question also that I keep repeating, which is there's an irony in our trying to create the equivalent to human intelligence when I think we accept that as humans we are intelligent but not necessarily rational. And so there, with large language models, trying to get them to be rational and logical and to produce truthful and accurate responses,
Uh-huh.
I still am not entirely comfortable that the goal is appropriate. Meaning, it like I use perplexity a lot because it gets me solid answers,
Uh-huh.
but it's not. I can't use it for writing or the sort of the normal large language model stuff
Uh-huh.
because it's very specific at looking at sources and giving me results based on those sources. So I do feel like I'm still waiting for there to be a better definition, larger cultural definition of what a large language model can do. It's creative, produces ideas, but we shouldn't be counting on it to be accurate.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and uh, related to that, Medium had a new article about grokking, which I was looking this up, and grokking. There's two definitions now. The current definition is to have multiple AI tools check each other's work and quality check, but in the machine learning field, apparently it's having so much data and so much information, maybe from another model, that you feed basically a whole other model of information into it, and it has so much information that it boosts and it can actually have its reasoning powers boosted. But that can be expensive. But now apparently they have ways to reduce that cost. But essentially, whether it's multiple AI tools checking each other, or if it's massive amounts of data and a whole other model of data being put into a new model, it's getting smarter and it's being able to reason more,
That
which
makes sense.
is never going to be human. Well, we can't say that, but for now, all intents and purposes for the
Yeah.
current, it's not going to be the same, but it could be. Who knows? It's inching toward that. So
It's still shocking to me how much it feels like I'm talking to an actual person when
yeah,
I'm doing research on a project and the information comes back and it's so well organized and so thoughtful and so articulate. And I'll say, I feel like I'm talking to a person, and the AI will remind me, no, I'm just an artificial intelligence. you know, but I'm like, this is this is sort of, if you told me that we had discovered alien technology that was being kept secret and that was what was driving large language models, it would not shock me because just alone the word weights and the tokens and the context windows, they just don't explain the human sense of interaction.
yeah, something else is happening. Yeah,
Something,
absolutely.
who knows? um, okay, so next is I use ChatGPT Advanced Voice to time travel, and I'm still shocked at how good it is. Again, I still don't have the OpenAI best version. I
Uh,
think this story was about talking to historical figures. And
yes.
is that correct? Do you
Yeah.
remember?
Well, and it goes to your point of you can't believe that it's not a human person. You can hear different voices, and it's really interesting. And it just came into my head as you were talking about using the voice feature, and when we talk to AI right now, when you talk to ChatGPT specifically, we'll just say, and I'm using the Juniper voice or whatever, it's the same voice throughout the whole thing. With the advanced voice, it can change its intonations. So it not only does it seem like you're talking to people, it can seem like you're talking to multiple people at the same time or overhearing a conversation. In one of these instances, you have somebody going to the past, to the Middle East, or I think it was the ancient Egypt, and you could hear a merchant and a farmer haggling over prices, and it would change voices. There were sound effects. So a completely different experience where the AI is taking multiple personas. So it's even more like you're listening to humans and kind of interacting with people. So kind of reminded me a little bit of that. I don't know if I mean, you probably wouldn't have, but in the 90s or the 2000s, there were these CDs that you could get with your cereal boxes that had games on them. And one of them was Carmen Sandiego, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego? And you would go back in time and talk to historical figures, different personas, but kind of the same thing a little bit of the computer is having different characters and but it's more immersive. It's amazing how what you can do. And you could have, obviously in the 90s a children's computer game, you couldn't go really deep into that. But with this, if you have the knowledge, if you want to talk about these different, economics in ancient Egypt with this merchant, he could go into that because he's really a computer. Yeah. Anyway, NPCs are coming to a whole new level. Uh,
It should be interesting. Okay, so Claude artifacts. The story was Claude artifacts to kill the App Store. And this kind of goes to the talk that Eric Schmidt gave at Stanford that got pulled down by Stanford,
mhm.
but then got reposted in other places, where he talked about, and he said this in sort of flip terms, but it was clearly an exaggerated future scenario, but where
Uh-huh.
you could build your own TikTok. You could go grab all of TikTok's data, and you could go grab this, and you could grab that, and you could build your own personal version of TikTok. He
Yeah.
was just being hyperbolic, but
Yeah.
the idea that you are going to be able to tell your computer to write a program for you, I think, is very real.
Uh-huh.
And I've used the large language models for script programming, which has helped me tremendously. We've talked about that before.
Yeah.
Sort of a little bit above my pay grade in terms of technical use, but I could figure out what was going on, and then I could ask questions if I ran into a problem. So for me, the scripting, kind of the HTML code, that kind of low level hacking, pretty amazing. I'm pretty confident I could write a Google Chrome extension now if I needed to.
Okay.
It's like you
Yeah.
can, because I have friends who wrote Chrome extensions, and I don't think it's rocket science, but I probably would be hesitant to do it. But I don't think I would be if I had a good large language model helping me.
Uh-huh.
But then this question of building more complex apps, I think, is really an interesting one. I do think, you know, uh, the companies that provide music are going to get better at allowing you to be very specific in your requests
Huh.
and use AI in the background. Like we've talked about before, AI is going to get integrated into everything.
Yeah.
But are there going to be things where we would say, we're talking probably 10 years from now, I need an app that will do this, this, and this, and it will do it? And my guess is that he's right. Who knows what the road to get there will be? But I think he's right. The programming capacity will be there to do it. That also means that there's programming capacity to do pretty malicious things. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. And in the
Yeah.
same way that you can now, uh, you know, uh, you can now do things with chemicals that weren't possible, 100 years ago, and so there are
Uh-huh.
all kinds of the dangers, substances and chemicals and the like, sort of deeper scientific work, and in those fields there are dangers, and so I think it's going to be interesting to see how we navigate these potential dangers.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, and it will be interesting to know how, because yes, there's an equal potential for good and for bad. Not to get philosophical, that's really deep, shallowly philosophical, but yeah, if you have a technology and it has these abilities, you can either use those appropriately and ethically, or you can use them unethically and inappropriately. So yeah, it's interesting to see who does what and what policies or best practices arise from that. So yeah,
Yeah, and not in our list of articles for this week, but there was one I read on dark GPTs, right?
yeah,
Dark chatbots. And of course, not a huge surprise. Lots of them being, or a lot of that use being for the producing of phishing emails
oh,
and other techniques, which I'm getting several times a day. Some kind of a sophisticated technique telling me, here's the PDF of your receipt for this particular product that you bought, or malware scanner, and call this number, or you've just purchased $2,000 worth of something, and here's your PayPal receipt. I'm
yeah,
sure trying to get me to call and actually get me on the line. So um, there's definitely that kind of dark web thing going on.
yeah,
Um, Speaking of which, AI deepfakes and implications for both the elections and on creativity. I
yeah,
think the deepfake issue is very real. I think as the technology continues to improve, there are all kinds of issues with inappropriate content, and unsuitable content, and then also where's the line where you're doing something humorous or within the public domain, or you're actually doing something that's going to harm someone.
yes,
Uh,
or yeah, at least manipulating people. I mean, yeah, anywhere
Yeah.
from manipulating people to actually harming people. Yeah,
Yeah. And
that's
again, the imagery has gone from what looked like really good studio photography. So you could sort of tell, like someone showed me Pinterest recently, and there's all of this AI stuff now on there that clearly AI generated. You can look for the flaws, but it's sort of like perfectly manicured rooms and everything all set up.
uh,
Um, and so you've got that, that use, but you've also got this question now of can you can produce a photograph that previously, if it looked too much like a studio photograph, the lighting was perfect for everybody in the picture, you say, okay, that's probably AI. Now there are forms of AI generating images that are intended not to have that look, but actually look like someone actually took it on their photograph. So there's blemishes on their phone, and there's blemishes, and there's things. So the ability to distinguish between real and fake, we've talked about this before, is just going to get difficult, I think.
yeah, yeah. Well, Leon Fersey a few weeks ago, or was it? No, it was 2 weeks ago, I think. He had a little thing. It was called Fake or Real, and you would go and you would assess 10 sets of 2 or 3 images, and you'd have to get the AI generated image out of the set. And I had a success rate of like 60%. I thought it was going to be higher, but 60%, which is the average. Most people only get all right 60% of the time. So it was kind of alarming that 40% of the time you don't happening.
And as Ethan Mollick reminds us, this is the worst AI we'll probably ever use, so it's only going to get harder.
In that context, it's really scary. Yeah, absolutely.
Before we move on from that,
Yes.
uh, somewhat related, Mark Zuckerberg published an open letter about the 2020 elections and censoring that they did, where they felt pressured by the government to censor certain things
Mhm.
that they feel now that were a mistake.
Yeah.
Um, but that letter, at least in my reading, wasn't a full acknowledgement of the degree to which Facebook themselves have been involved in processes to choose what to promote and not to promote, and to ban or shadow ban. And again, I think these are hard cultural questions. But if we are purporting to be unbiased and to allow people to produce things and to have there be a little bit of a messy forum in democracy,
Mhm.
then there is the concern that AI will only up the game of those who believe that it's appropriate to uh, withhold information or shape the story or shape the narrative.
That's true. Well, and it did do that, especially ChatGPT did more previously.
Mhm.
Now it doesn't as much, but before, I mean, that didn't matter. We got a year ago. If the election would have been a year ago, you would have had all sorts of stuff with all these censored things from AI, and people were believing AI back then. So yeah, you need to be cognizant of those things, and a lot of people aren't. So, and one thing um, that is related to this on Facebook, I've been seeing a lot of stories, a lot of things about people. They seem to be legitimately like little anecdotes about their lives, like movie stars or musicians or something. But if you read carefully, they're AI generated stories that seem plausible, but they're completely fake. And there are many people who actually will go and they will say, I remember that this happened 30 years ago. I remember it happened, but it didn't. It did not happen. So it's kind of crazy that people who were there and people who would know have false memories because the AI stories are so convincing. So,
Which again, that's helping us to understand how the human mind works. I mean, I think we've got lots of experiments about uh, the ways in which we will go along with things and will comply. Um, the famous Milgram experiment and others that uh, help us to remember that our brains are built in a certain way, and then we have to be careful. I do think we're very susceptible to large scale propaganda, and I think we have to be asking ourselves the questions about um, uh, when and how should that be used, and is it okay? Um, there was a brilliant Tucker Carlson interview of a guy named Mike Benz, where he went through like sort of 30 years of how governments use propaganda. And if anybody has access to it or is interested, it was an unbelievably interesting watch to realize that this goes on quite a bit. Okay, so the California legislation has passed. I'm thinking the governor has signed it. So this
Okay.
is going to have lots of implications. I don't know what the full implications of it are, but I think it's going to make a difference.
I think it will, and I think it's, to be fair, to be honest, I think it's a little futile of them to think that they can do this, but they're going to have watermarking of AI generated content or synthetic content, a a hybrid, but like, I don't know. You
Yeah,
could
well,
always not do the watermark. I mean, how what are you gonna? I mean, people can remove watermarks. So
it's a little bit like the gun laws. The the
yeah,
the, the honest people obey the gun laws. The people who are going to cause harm don't obey the gun laws. And
uh,
so I think the point you're making, or that I'm hearing, is um, asking for it and actually having it be helpful. Well, it will
uh,
be at a certain level, but there are going to be people who are not going to follow it.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and what I mean, I think it's going to be effective is I think it's going to raise the dialogue around a lot of these issues, which needs to be raised. Meaning there are going to be court battles, there are going to be all kinds of things that go on here where we're going to have to actually figure out what's okay and what's not.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of harkens back a little bit to the abilities of AI. Like we're gonna see what it can and can't do, and then we're gonna have to make laws from that. But making laws preemptively against things that may or may not happen, it seems a good idea, but you never, yeah, exactly. People are gonna follow it or they're not gonna follow it, or new abilities are gonna come, and then what are you gonna do? You're gonna have to make another law about those. So yeah, you never know. But
Okay. I don't feel qualified to talk about the election stories, but clearly people are talking about the election stories.
yeah, yeah. There are a lot of people who were talking about elections. A lot of people are fearful that they're going to bias them. A lot of companies are vying for campaigns to use their AI tools to for all sorts of purposes. And it seems like both campaigns are a little wary of them, except for they're both relying on AI imagery in some instances, it
Yeah.
seems. And they're not admitting it, and they're actually vilifying those who are speaking out and saying, "Hey, that's an AI generated image." Both campaigns. So it's interesting to see. But a lot of people, again, for the most part, you have um, very wary, and everyone is fearful that they're going to use AI to bias things. But it seems like they're still not for the most part. So, but let's go back to now to a deep dive, which is talking about our most central um, topic that we like to talk about on this podcast, and that's AI in the workplace. Lots of stuff about AI in the workplace lately.
Yeah. So two articles that I highlighted. One is um, that businesses are using AI without telling their customers or employees.
Mhm.
And another was that employees are secretly using AI at work. I thought the one about the employees was super interesting because there was one of the statistics was the degree to which the employees were having higher job satisfaction because of the AI. I kept looking for a statistic that would give like a productivity boost, but
Uh-huh.
the 81% of AI users reported improved productivity. So the 4 out of 5 said their productivity improved. 24% said they had a higher overall job satisfaction, 23% better ability to manage stress, and 29% more likely to feel passionate about their work.
Okay.
So I think this makes sense. And part of this could probably just be attributed to the fact that you're doing something different, right?
Yeah.
If you've been doing the
Yes.
job the same way, and so you're learning new skills and doing things, and a certain percentage of people are going to be more inclined to do that than others. But I also know that for myself, I'm doing things I haven't been able to do before. Projects that I've wanted to work on now seem more realistic than they did before.
Uh-huh.
And so it's kind of exciting and it's fun. You had a graph from the other article, right?
Yes.
And it was about the percentage of people who fell into different categories of usage.
Yeah.
And I think it was 7%, 8% in the leading area
Let
where
me
they
see.
were
Yeah.
leading. Yeah,
8% of companies are leading. 30%, 28% are implementing, actually having businesses or AI tools in their internal affairs. And then 48% are developing, which what does that exactly mean? And then 60% are emerging. So it seems like a slightly bias toward emerging um, of using AI tools, but it's a pretty standard curve. I mean, it's not perfect, but it is a pretty standard bell curve. So
Well, and that's just businesses who are using AI and chatbots.
yes,
So
that's true.
what it doesn't count is the businesses who aren't. And that's not a statistic I know, but I'm guessing there's some portion of businesses that have just avoided it.
That's true. Yeah, you would. Yeah, especially ones that handle private data and confidential data. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Related to that, yeah, employees are secretly using AI at work, and then businesses are using AI. But then you have Australia who's finding that AI underperforms related to human employees, and so that kind of shows that you need human oversight. They tried to use, they kind of argue that AI shouldn't be used at all. You should never use AI, but I think what they're saying, but the implication is that you need to have human employees who are overseeing AI tools. And it seems like a lot of these studies that are saying AI is not useful is like, haha, you shouldn't be using it. We told you. But both camps of, use AI for everything and then AI is awful are missing the point where in the middle, where you have to have a human AI interaction, a human machine collaboration. And that's kind of the sweet spot that has things happen. And I'm wondering what perspective Klarna is using on that, because Klarna is planning to have their workforce allegedly as AI replaces human jobs. Literally, I mean, this is kind of the stuff we were talking about, where AI is AI is having the workforce, and we have a company here, Klarna, who that is allegedly what they're doing. So kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen. And I think robotics are going to play a role in this as well. Uh,
Yeah,
it's
that's
going
true.
to, and I think that's why a lot of the big names in the high tech world are looking at universal basic income, because they're predicting that there will be a problem with having enough work for workers to do. I don't know if that's going to play out. Again, that's probably just predictive, not necessarily meaning it's going to happen. But I do think people are worried about it. That as the AI gets better and better, it's going to be able to replace more and more human activity. I mean, this is going to sound like an old guy's argument, but when I call a business and it uses a form of AI to try and direct me to where I need to go, and I cannot get where I need to go and get the right answer,
Uh-huh.
I do feel resentful. Put a human being on the other end of this call. I don't like spending 10 minutes trying to convince you to let me talk to an agent because the thing I'm calling about doesn't fit into one of your easy categories where you're trying to get me to hear a canned response.
Yeah, it's kind of infuriating when like you don't really know why they're doing this. It seems like a lot of companies are just using robots or just using AI because it's cool, because it increased their productivity. But to put it in the context of data collection, when I was talking about the companies that were using the AI tools and saying, oh, only 8% are leading, you brought up the point that that's only the companies that reported AI usage. So when everybody's talking about, oh, it's increasing productivity, oh, it's solving all of our problems, that's only the people who are going to report those things. So
Yeah.
anyway, so just a little message about data bias and data skewing. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what types of people are going and companies and businesses are going to use it. I've been approached by several businesses and people who are using it, and it seems like I'm able to talk them with some difficulty, but I'm able to talk them down from the ledge of I'm going to automate every single thing in my business. It's kind of scary to, okay, we're going to use it productively. I'm going to have this more of a piecemeal effort, piecemeal thing. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I would be interested it'll be interesting to see these businesses that are using them to replace or mostly replace human jobs, how that goes.
Yeah. There will probably be some hard lessons learned there.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
you're right. Okay, another interesting week. The news doesn't stop on the AI front. Thanks,
No, it does
everybody.
not. Thank you very
Thanks
much.